Hi, everyone. This is a video about how to select a sample for both your pilot study and your dissertation. And what I recommend is that you have the graphic organizer in front of you. It is called the Participants and Data Collection Graphic Organizer. It's got one column for your dissertation, one column for your pilot study. And as you watch this video, be thinking about how you want to sample. Usually for your pilot study, it's very simple. It's, kind of someone you're interviewing or something like that. But I want you to be thinking all the way through towards your dissertation and mapping that out, because you'll be having a lot of thoughts about that as we go through. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. This is essentially some slides that will help walk us through sampling. Okay. So again, this is, we're looking through the pilot study towards our dissertation, but it's also going to be helpful as you essentially write up the methods and participant selection of your pilot study, because in both cases, you need to justify your sample. Why are you choosing these people, this population, this way of going about gathering data? Okay. So, getting a decent sample has to do with thinking about variance, which I know you thought about during your quantitative class, but you also need to think about in terms of qualitative as well. So think about, you usually want to compare maybe one or maybe two important categories. Sometimes you don't, sometimes in an interview you don't, but in an interview study. But in many cases, there's a couple of categories and you want to make sure you have enough people of each category so that you can have something to say about that. And then this is the piece people don't think about. You don't want there to be too much variance across other categories or aspects of these people. And don't worry, I'll give you lots of examples. Okay, so this first thing right here, the example research question that I'm going to use right now is adapted from one of my students. How do kindergarten and preschool teachers support students with IEPs through the transition to kindergarten? Okay, the last part of that research question is not that important for this lecture. The piece that's important is this idea of how do kindergarten and preschool teachers support students with IEPs? Okay, so if I want to make sure, if I'm selecting a sample, whether that's survey or interview, and I want to make sure I have variance across one or two important categories, think about the important categories of people here, right? And the most clearly important one is that I would want to make sure I have kindergarten teachers and preschool teachers. Again, whether I have a survey or whether I have interviews, and that I have enough of each. So if I was to do 10 interviews in an interview study, I wouldn't want 9 kindergarten and 1 preschool, right? But we want to think about, is there any other variation that we should be thinking about, right? So one area I wonder is whether I want to be careful about my selection of teachers that are special education teachers versus gen ed teachers. Like, is that an important category to think about? Another thing might be district. Like, do policies vary enough across districts? I need to be thoughtful about this category. Or does the way transition support practices happen vary across districts? What about gender? What about race? Like, so really thinking about all the ways people can be categorized, and do those things matter, right? Like, that's what I'm trying to think about. All right. So here are my thoughts, right? Like, definitely I want kindergarten and preschool teachers based on this research question. When I think about it some more, I want to treat special education and general education also as an important category. So I may actually want to make sure I take this into account in my sampling. Then I actually think district matters as well. So special education and general education, one way I can take it into account is I can only interview general ed, or I can only interview special ed. Right? So that would be taking out the variance. I'd be saying, I want to have kindergarten and preschool, and I just don't want it to vary in any other parameters. Or I could say, I need kindergarten and preschool teachers that are both special education and general education teachers, in which case I need to make sure I have enough kindergarten special ed and kindergarten general ed, and enough preschool special ed and preschool general ed. All right. In the meantime, I think district matters, but I'm hecka not going to be like, I need enough special ed, general ed, kindergarten, preschool, and enough in this district and enough in that district. So I might actually hold the district constant and be like, I just want one district. So I'm not varying in this important category. But other categories like gender, I might say, you know what? I don't think that matters that much for this research, and I'm just not going to care. Like I'm going to ignore that as a selection factor. So one thing you might want to do right now is brainstorm what are the important categories within your research and which ones matter, which ones don't matter, which ones do you want to hold constant, and which ones do you want to actually have enough people across them. So if I say I want kindergarten teachers, I want to compare in my research kindergarten teachers versus preschool teachers, but I also want to see what's going on for special ed versus general education. In a survey, in a dissertation, by the way, not in a pilot study, I probably want 10 or so in each subcategory. So I might want 10 kindergarten special ed teachers, 10 kindergarten general ed teachers, 10 preschool special ed, and 10 preschool gen ed. The reason why is that if I have 10 in each, I can actually say something about what's going on. If I have 3 preschool special education teachers, that sample could be greatly skewed, right? Like one very irritated teacher could change those numbers a lot. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. In interviews, I would want to make sure I have 2 or 3 in those subcategories. So 2 or 3 kindergarten special ed, 2 or 3 kindergarten general ed, and so on. Again, because if I actually want to understand what's going on in that category of kindergarten special ed or kindergarten general ed, I'm going to need to make sure there's enough people that I'm talking to. If I just talk to one person in each category, I'm very much getting whatever their perspectives are. It's very much, influenced by their personality, their experiences, which is all fine. But if I want to get like a little bit higher viewpoint, if I interview 3, I can usually get some sense of what's happening, across. All right. Again, I've selected one district, so I don't have to worry about how kindergarten special ed teachers in one district have experience versus kindergarten special ed in another district. All right, so I'm trying to hold some things constant. Okay, so you may want to pause right now and really take some time to think about categories. This is also something you can talk to me about in meetings as we try to work through things. And I am, in the next set, going to give you different types of sampling within categories, and we'll talk through different kinds of research questions. Okay, so types of sampling. I've taken a lot of this from Maria and Parker, which is the survey book that we use in class. But this is also, of course, upheld across a lot of methods books. And I'm going to talk about these 5 kinds of sampling. So convenient sampling. This is something you're very likely to do in a pilot study. All right. And that is so perfectly delightful and fine. The idea is that you simply ask whoever you already know, or people, to do the interview, to do the survey. Okay. Now, my example research question here is, what is the experience of Black male students with an ED designation in special education? Some of these research questions might look a little familiar to you, by the way. It is okay in the pilot study to be like, I'm just going to interview 2 students that are the kids of friends of mine. That's a convenient sample, and that is totally fine for the pilot study. But be aware in terms of weaknesses that this might cause some problems with, you're going to get what we call a skewed sample. This sample is going to be kids of friends of yours, right? So they're going to have a certain kind of experience. They're not going to be like all the kids that are designated ED, okay? Now, getting that, I would definitely not recommend a convenient sample, by the way, for your dissertation. It's a little bit too non-theoretical. Moving a little bit more broadly is something called a snowball sample. Okay, and this is where you might have one or two people or three that you know in that category, and then you ask them to recommend others. So an example research question for this might be, how do Black women in educational leadership perceive the racialized experiences they encounter in their pre-K-12 work environments? So in this case, maybe you know 3 or 4 Black women educational leaders, and you think that their perspectives would be very helpful. And then you ask them to recommend more. So you're expanding your sample beyond just who you know to be a little bit more broad. This could be known as key respondents. And I have a citation there for you, right? Like sometimes you want to interview the people who have the most critical perspective, who have been aware of racialized experiences. If that's the case, a snowball sample might work well, right? Again, there's the issue of skew. So there may be Black women in educational leadership that do not have a critical perspective, or they're not friends with the people you know, and that you're missing their perspectives. You have to be very cautious about how you interpret the what you get from your interviews. Now, another, whoops, I skipped one, way to do it is through theoretical sampling. For many of you, doing an interview study or a case study, theoretical sampling is what you will do. So remember this word. And so I'm going back to the question I used originally: how do kindergarten and preschool teachers support students with IEPs in the transition to kindergarten? Here, your research question is guiding your sampling. Just like I talked about before, it's theoretical sampling is that I want to interview kindergarten teachers, I want to interview preschool teachers, right? And that I think special education matters. I think general education matters. Theoretical sampling might also lead you to identify other traits that matter in ways that are not quite so obvious. So in this case, maybe it's teachers with a lot of experience. You might want to think about that. What I talked about with the district is part of theoretical sampling. In other words, maybe I want to compare policies across districts. And so I stick with only kindergarten and preschool general education teachers. So I'm taking out the special ed component, but I want to look at them across 2 different districts. So I'm comparing across districts. That would be a theoretical sampling move. Okay. And that is so strong. That's a really strong sampling approach. However, it's not super, it can be okay for surveys, I would say, if it's combined with cluster sampling, which I'll talk about in a little bit, okay? Now, random sampling is what most of you have heard about, right? This is how they do politics and, well, at least that's how they say they do it. Okay, right? So this is the idea of just like, I want to interview, so I gave a research question: what is the role of accountability in elementary science teaching practice in the Bay Area? So the idea is, who are all the elementary teachers in the Bay Area, and randomly sample them and send them a survey. You can imagine how well that would work, right? Supposedly, you would have a great sample because it would be random, but of course, many of those teachers would not do the survey. Most of them wouldn't. So in some ways you can control for differences, right? So if I just sent the survey to people I know, I'm gonna have some real issues, right? Like I'm gonna have people who are like, I love science teaching, I do lots of it. I'm not gonna really get a sense of what's going on. So if I randomly sample and they do the survey, I might get a better sense of what's really going on. But unfortunately, there's this huge problem that people do not actually take the survey, right? Or they're uninterested, or they don't have the right knowledge. So that can be a really big problem. I really don't recommend any of you do random sampling in this way. You may want to do random sampling as part of cluster sampling. So instead of being totally random in this research question, the role of accountability in elementary science teaching, I could sample within levels. So I could actually say, all right, there's 30 districts in the Bay Area. I'm going to randomly sample 10 of them. Then in each of those districts, there's 10 to 20 schools. I'm going to randomly sample half the schools in each of those 10 districts. Then in each of those schools, I might either ask all the teachers or randomly sample teachers. So cluster sampling, or it's also known as stratified sampling. Oh my goodness. You can kind of get that sense of like, if I chose these districts and then I chose these schools and so forth randomly, then hopefully the responses I get are still distributed in a way where I can understand what's going on for a wider variety of teachers, but I have the resources to actually contact the districts, contact the schools, and contact the teachers in order to try to help get them to take the survey. Okay, so you still have the problem of teachers maybe not having all the knowledge or not taking the survey, but it mitigates it quite a lot. So some of you might end up doing this. In this case, we are kind of moving more towards survey methods. Sometimes in interview studies we do this, but most of the time this is where we're leaning towards survey methodology. And you can see in these examples that I often will even create like a figure to try to help me do cluster sampling, right? Like, so maybe if I'm trying to compare across schools within one district, so back to the kindergarten and preschool teachers and the kindergarten transition activities, I might sample 10 teachers in each school. Of course, there's not actually 10 kindergarten and preschool teachers, but like something like that. If I'm comparing a couple of districts, maybe I have district 1 and 2 that I've sampled somehow, and I randomly sample 3 schools out of each district, but do all of the teachers. So you can see how you start to think about that piece. And, if you are sitting here thinking, oh my gosh, how in the world do I do this? Don't worry, I'm here for you. We can talk through it. Also, colleagues of yours might be able to help you talk through it. So a final note on sampling issues for surveys. There are almost always people who choose not to take it. So you really have to think about that. You usually want 70% of the people you reach out to take the survey, or else you start to get where you're like, why don't these other people take the survey? And can I really generalize to the population that I'm trying to think about? So in the case of the kindergarten and preschool transition teachers, if only, let's say I choose one district, but only 5 kindergarten teachers respond to my survey out of 30, those 5 teachers probably are really excited about supporting students with IEPs, right? And so I'm going to get a different idea of what's going on for them than is really generalizable to the district as a whole, right? And when I do a survey, I want to be able to say, kindergarten teachers in this district generally have this experience. And if only 5 do it, it's not going to get there. Now, in terms of general sizes, it depends so much. It might be half of the people, it might be 70% if you're going for like a whole district. If you have like a huge population, you might want just a total of 100. So again, we can talk through these numbers. Now for your pilot study, 10 is fine. Interview sampling issues, you have the same situation. And actually, I've gotten in trouble for this, by the way, in publications where you don't want to just be like, oh yeah, I interviewed 1 person or 2 people with this characteristic, and I'm going to be like, yeah, they're like this. That you really want 2 or 3 from each subgroup in order to, again, make claims. And this is for your dissertation, in order to make claims about it. And generally speaking, for your dissertation, you want 12 to 15 interviews overall for an interview study. Case studies are different because you have lots of different data, by the way. For your pilot study, you only need 2 pieces of data. So if you're doing an interview study, it's okay just to interview 2 people. But if you have 2 different groups, I really recommend you interview 1 from each group so that you get a sense of what that's like. All right. Hopefully this will get you started on your sampling. And please put any questions, of course, in the comments.